My name is Emily, and I am an ordinary 29-year-old woman living alone in a small, cozy apartment. Today, I sit at the dining table, looking at my phone. It's been ringing and turning off for an hour, but I can't bring myself to answer. It's Mark, my fiancé, wanting to talk about meeting my parents. Just the thought of it makes me feel nauseous. Mark's voice comes through the voicemail again. Hey, just checking in. We really need to schedule that meeting with your parents. Call me back, okay? His voice, which usually brings me a sense of calm, only increases my anxiety now. I sighed and looked around my apartment. There's nothing special about it, but it's mine. The walls are filled with bookshelves I've collected over the years, filled with books, each one dear to me. The small balcony offers a view of the city, noisy, always in motion, but here, in my little fortress, I've always managed to escape the hustle and bustle. It's my refuge, away from the memories of my childhood. Growing up wasn't easy. My father left when I was 5. I still remember that day, a gray morning, the wet road outside the window, and my father's heavy footsteps in the hall. His suitcase seemed too big for someone leaving forever. He hugged me for a second but didn't even look back as he walked out. I stood in the doorway, feeling empty, while my mother said nothing, her face like stone. After he left, everything changed. My mother became different, cold, distant, as if not only love but all the warmth from her soul had left. There was always a tiredness in her eyes, mixed with something else, maybe disappointment. It often seemed to me that I had become her personal target. She was strict with me, nitpicked the smallest things, and I learned to stay silent so as not to provoke another outburst of her anger. When I turned 7, she married Rick, my stepfather. He was a good man, patient and kind. I saw how hard he tried to fix our family, but his efforts were in vain. My mother's attention was focused entirely on Lily, my younger half-sister. Lily was bright, loud, and my mother literally adored her. Kind words, gifts, hugs, all of it went to Lily, while I stayed on the sidelines. My mother seemed to live for her successes, proud of her smile, as if Lily were the perfect daughter I could never be. Another call brought me back to reality. It was Mark again. His persistence stirred up irritation and guilt in me. I picked up the phone, though my voice trembled. Hey, Mark, I said, trying to sound cheerful. Emily, I've been trying to reach you. When can we meet your parents? His voice sounded sincere. He really wanted this. I gripped the pen on the table and started twirling it, as if my answer depended on it. I'm not sure, Mark. It's complicated. What's complicated? It's just dinner. I really want to meet the people who raised my incredible fiancé. He smiled, I could feel it. I forced out a laugh, which sounded strained even to me. You wouldn't say that if you knew my mom. She isn't easy, I admitted. Mark fell silent. The few seconds felt like an eternity. It's okay, You know you can tell me anything. I took a deep breath, as if preparing to jump into icy water. It's just that things aren't great between my mom and me. She's always been strict with me. It's nothing like your family. His voice softened. I'm here for you, Emily. We'll handle this together. Maybe it's time to face it. I knew he was right. But the thought of confronting my mother and exposing Mark to her sharp tongue and cold behavior terrified me. Yeah, maybe, I mumbled, not believing my own words. Let's talk about it later. I need time to think, okay? Okay. I love you, you know that? I know, Mark. I love you too, I replied, and hung up the phone. I sat in the silence of my apartment, trying to cope with the flood of memories. The years after my father left were filled with a coldness that even my stepfather's weak attempts to fix our life couldn't warm. My mother seemed to vent all her pain and resentment on me, and I didn't know how to be someone else so she would love me. Maybe Mark is right, and it's time to deal with this, but what if it breaks the fragile balance I've worked so hard to create? I remember that evening especially clearly. I was only 7, sitting at the kitchen table, carefully writing letters for my homework. The silence in the room was broken only by the rustling of paper and the tapping of my pencil. My mother, busy with something at the stove, paced back and forth, her face tense. Suddenly, she turned to me, and her usually even voice cracked. "Emily, don't you see I'm busy? Stop making noise with your pencil." Her words struck painfully. I looked up, trying to understand what had caused her irritation. "Sorry, Mom," I muttered, trying to speak more quietly. These moments seemed so insignificant to me at the time, but as the years passed, I realized how important they were. My mother changed when Rick came into our lives. He was soft, kind, a man who tried to ease the tension in the house. With him, my mother seemed happier, her face more alive, but that happiness seemed to pass me by. When Lily was born, everything changed for good. It was as though I had become invisible. My mother devoted all her time to her younger daughter, filling her life with the care and warmth that I had always longed for, but never received. I remember one of those evenings when I accidentally overheard a conversation between my mother and Rick in the living room. I shouldn't have heard it, but I couldn't resist. Their voices were muffled, but loud enough for me to understand the meaning. "She's so complicated, Rick," my mother said. "With Lily, it's different. I don't know what to do with her." Her voice was filled with disappointment. Even then, I understood that she was talking about me. Rick tried to calm her down. "Helen, she's just a child. She needs your love, not your disappointment." But my mother disagreed. "You don't understand. She reminds me too much of him," she said bitterly. Those words pierced my heart like sharp needles. I remember lying in my bed for a long time, trying to hold back the tears. That was the night I realized once and for all, I was not the daughter my mother wanted. Over the years, the gap between us only grew. I desperately tried to win her approval, but my efforts seemed to make things worse. When I was 10, I drew a picture at school and proudly brought it home. "Mom, look, I got an A for it," I said happily, handing her my work. She gave it a quick glance and returned to whatever she was doing. "That's nice, sweetie. Go show Rick, I'm busy." Rick, as always, was different. He smiled, took my drawing, looked at it carefully, and praised me. "This is fantastic, Emily. You're really talented." His kind words warmed me, but they couldn't fill the emptiness left by my mother's indifference. When I became a teenager, that emptiness turned into a deep wound. I felt like I was constantly walking a tightrope. Any wrong word or action could trigger another wave of my mother's reproaches. Her criticism was relentless, and I learned to be invisible to avoid unnecessary remarks. I was 15 when an event, in particular, had a profound impact on my self-esteem. I was getting ready for the school dance. That evening, I chose a dress that I thought highlighted my figure. I spun around in front of the mirror, feeling a rare sense of confidence. "Mom, can you help me with my hair?" I called as I walked out of my room. She looked up from her magazine and scanned me from head to toe. "You're wearing that? It's a bit tight. Don't you think you should watch your weight?" Her words hit me like a slap in the face. I froze, unsure of what to say. I thought it looked fine," I mumbled, trying to hide my tears. Mom sighed as she stood up. "Let me do your hair. Maybe that will distract from your figure." I remained silent while she combed my hair. Her touches were quick and businesslike, but there was no warmth in them. That night, I went to the dance, but all my confidence had melted away. I looked at the other girls, so bright, so happy, and felt small and insignificant. These moments stayed with me. There were too many of them to forget. Each one was a reminder that, despite my efforts, I was always not enough. I sat there in silence, feeling small and ashamed, as my mother roughly styled my hair. Every movement of hers was sharp, and I felt as though she was trying to fix me, not for my sake, but to satisfy her own demands. In her hands, my hair became something awkward, devoid of lightness and freedom. She didn't say anything, only tugged me into position, adjusting everything she thought needed fixing. I felt her cold severity even in these mundane moments. School wasn't a place where I could escape from it all. Sometimes, when classes ended, I stayed alone because I didn't know how to find my place among the other kids. One day, sitting at lunch with a few classmates, we started talking about our families, as often happens in such conversations, casual chats that always hide some personal truth. "Hey, Emily, who's your mom?" asked Sarah, one of the girls I was sitting with. She said it so casually, as though this question couldn't possibly have any weight, and I felt something inside me freeze. I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. Sarah was open, bright, her world simple and clear, while mine was complicated and tangled, like a maze with no way out. In response to her question, I said, trying to find the right words. She's strict. Very particular about things. I hesitated, not knowing how to add anything more accurate. But even those words felt insufficient. They didn't capture the essence. I couldn't say that my mom wasn't just strict, but also closed off, that her love was wrapped like barbed wire, hard to feel. Sarah looked a bit confused, sensing the tension in my voice. But she didn't understand what I was going through. "Hey, it's okay, moms can be tough, mine's always on my side when it comes to grades," she tried to comfort me. I forced myself to smile, appreciating her attempt to make things better, but inside me, the emptiness grew. I knew her mom could be strict, but she'd never felt the abyss of alienation that I felt with mine. My situation was different, more isolated, and there was no one who could support me in what felt so personal and painful. It wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a chasm that nothing could bridge. Things at home became even more tense. When I started showing an interest in boys, my mother's focus shifted entirely to my grades, as if that was the only thing that mattered. My personal struggles, little joys, and worries, none of these seemed to register with her. My mother couldn't understand that for me, it was not just about how well I did in school, but also about how I felt about my own life. One day, when Jake, a guy from school, came over to study, my mother immediately told me I had to put all my things back in their place and not get distracted by trivialities. With her cold stare, the one she used to judge anything that went beyond her strict rules, I felt like I was under constant surveillance. In that moment, I just wanted to run away, escape to a place where I could be myself, where no one would question every step I took. Jake was nothing like the people who occupied spaces in her world. He didn't know all these rules and boundaries she tried to impose on my life, and maybe that was exactly what drew me to him. He was alive, real, unlike my mother, who was so detached from reality, her cool demands overshadowing everything around her. When my mother finally paid attention to Jake, she spoke to him too sternly. "Make sure Emily finishes her work before evening, she doesn't have much time." Her voice was cold, devoid of any real interest in what was actually happening between us in that moment. I felt her gaze piercing me, as if she were trying to check everything, even things that didn't concern her. My life during those days felt like a series of small dramas, hidden behind the doors of this apartment, which always remained the place where I had to be correct and content. And even though everything felt alien to me, I continued playing the role my mother had prepared for me since childhood. From that moment, the evening went downhill. Every time I said something, my mother found a way to turn it into criticism. It didn't matter what I talked about or what I tried to suggest, every word I spoke collided with her cold, piercing logic. I knew she wasn't going to support me. The evening became sluggish and unbearable. Alex, my boyfriend at the time, sensed the atmosphere, and we quickly decided to leave. But even at the moment we were leaving the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I couldn't return there without feeling guilty. "I'm so sorry, Alex," I said, as usual, apologizing. "It can be hard with my mom." Alex squeezed my hand but didn't let go. His eyes looked at me with soft understanding, but there was also a faint trace of weariness. "Hey, it's not your fault," he said, smiling, but his smile was cautious, as if he knew this conversation would continue far beyond that night. "But it does complicate things a little, doesn't it?" I knew he wasn't talking about me. He was talking about my mother, her heavy, gloomy nature, her way of ruining even the best moments. I realized he was right. And although he never said it outright, there was an uncertainty in his voice, as he tried to figure out how to support me in this relationship. Over time, our relationship with Alex still fell apart, and it wasn't just because of that night. It was more than just one moment, one conversation. It was a pattern. My insecurity, reinforced by my mother's constant humiliation, prevented me from building healthy relationships. I was like a tide anchor, always pulling me down, despite all my attempts to rise. Years passed, and I met Mark. He was different, gentle, kind, and patient. He had an amazing ability to make me feel valuable, worthy of love and respect. With him, I could be myself, without worrying about the opinion of others, especially my mother's. But despite all his kindness, the scars of the past always stayed with me, like invisible stains on my heart. They didn't disappear. Every time I tried to feel safe, those scars reminded me of their presence. Every time I began to trust, they returned, quietly, but relentlessly, creeping toward my most vulnerable spots. One evening, when we were sitting in my apartment talking about the future, I suddenly felt the cold fingers of fear grip my heart. We were sitting close, Mark carefully holding a cup of tea, his eyes filled with tenderness and hope, but in that calmness, I saw inevitability. We were talking about marriage, about how we would build our lives together. His words sounded so easy, as if the future was simple and clear. "Emily," he said, his voice soft but carrying a seriousness, "I love you and I want." I stopped him, not letting him continue. Inside, I felt something I couldn't explain in words. I knew it was important, that he had said exactly what I had been waiting for, but something inside me resisted. I couldn't understand why. Maybe it was because, even in his simple words, I could feel the insecurity still lingering inside me, like a heavy burden I couldn't shake off. "I love you too," I replied, but even in this simple confession, there was a note of unease. I couldn't deceive him. I couldn't deceive myself. But I need time. I'm not sure I can. I can't be the way you want me to be." Mark looked at me carefully, his face unchanged, but in his gaze, there was something new, understanding. He wasn't the type to make me feel guilty. Instead, he stayed silent, lifting my hand and gently kissing it. It was such a simple yet powerful gesture, and I felt my walls begin to crumble, even though I still remained in fear. I didn't know what to do. I lacked the confidence to believe that I could be happy, even with someone like Mark. I didn't know if I was worthy of being with him, with my mother constantly pulling me down with her heavy words, judgments, and silent accusations. Mark spoke again, his voice quieter. It was as if he were trying to catch every glance, every emotion that flickered through me. "You don't have to be perfect, Emily. I love you for who you are, not for who you should be for someone else." I closed my eyes, trying to grasp the meaning of his words. And although I knew they were full of kindness, I still felt that fear, that doubt that wouldn't give me peace. It was quiet at home, with only the faint sound of the television occasionally drifting in from the next room. The silence, which I had once desperately sought, now felt heavy and suffocating. It was a reminder of how much had been left unresolved, as if everything in my home had been frozen in some undefined time. And this silence lasted until Mark broke it with his soft, but clear voice. "It seems like your mom is curious about my business," he said, looking up from the cup of tea he was holding. "Maybe even too much." I sighed, feeling a cold wave of exhaustion sweep over me. We were both sitting in the kitchen, the dim light making the evening feel unnatural. I tried to smooth things over, but I knew that once again, nothing would work. Yes, she had her own way of evaluating people, as if deciding who deserved attention and who did not. My mom had always been this way, merciless to the weaknesses and trivialities of others, things she could latch onto like bones that shouldn't be left unnoticed. "I'm sorry, Mark. It's just how it's always been," I said, trying to justify her, though I couldn't find any logical explanation for her behavior. He silently squeezed my hand. It was his quiet promise, his calmness, into which I tried to believe. Despite everything that was happening, he remained unshaken. He was reserved, as though he knew how hard it was for me to take criticism, how difficult it was to live with the constant feeling that all my actions were subject to harsh judgment. "We're in this together, Emily," he said, and there was no pity in his voice. He sought only support and equality in this. "You're not alone." Those words felt like a stone thrown into murky water. He wasn't trying to find excuses or justifications. He was simply there, ready to support, not to judge. This was important. This was what I had long been searching for, not knowing how deeply I needed someone to simply understand and accept me as I am. The morning after dinner, I still couldn't shake off my mom's words. Each of her comments felt like a blow to my very core, as if she was constantly trying to squeeze me into a small box where I had to conform to her ideas of what was right and wrong. From time to time, I tried to tell myself not to worry, that it was just her method. But as soon as I faced her, all my self-confidence melted away, like snow under the first spring sun. We sat in silence, and I was absorbed in these thoughts, when suddenly Mark's phone rang. It was an unknown number. I saw his face change, curiosity giving way to clear shock. He froze for a moment, then, obviously not believing his ears, said, "Wait, what did you just say?" His voice was oddly tense, and he looked as if he had heard something completely unexpected, something out of place. I could only watch as he turned his face to the wall, trying to understand what was happening. A faint, muffled voice on the other end of the line barely reached my ears, but I couldn't make out the words. There was something in that voice that made me feel uneasy. Mark hung up the phone, and his face was contorted with a mix of confusion and anger. "It was your mom," he said, not hiding his irritation. She spoke to this person, and it wasn't normal." I looked at him, not understanding. What could she be hoping for, interfering in my life like this? I felt uncomfortable, only able to guess the contents of their conversation. How dare she interfere in my relationship with him like this? And what now? We both sat in silence, and at that moment, all I felt was a deep, unspeakable exhaustion. Everything was back to that point when I was a little girl, trying to find my place in a world where everything was under someone else's control. Mark looked at me, his eyes full of questions, but there was no reproach in them. He was waiting for me to explain what was going on, and I realized that this was possibly the beginning of something much bigger than just a disagreement with my mom. A chasm was opening up in my life again, and I didn't know how to fill it. After I hung up the phone, I felt a true whirlwind of emotions, like a hurricane flooding my entire being. Pain, anger, confusion, all tangled in a restless knot. But amid the chaos, there was also a sense of purpose, as sharp and clear as the edge of a knife. Mark and I came up with a plan. Finally, it was time to reveal my mother's true nature, her manipulations, and the hidden intentions I had long failed to see or didn't want to see. We were going to catch her in her own game. The next few days were like blurry patches, moments of planning, endless discussions about how to approach this, and the fear I tried to hide because I knew that if we didn't do it now, it would be too late. But Mark was there, supporting me, and that gave me strength. We decided to set up a meeting where I could see everything for myself. Mark arranged to meet my mom at a cafe in the city center, and I, in turn, decided to be there, but disguised. I had to see how she would behave, not knowing I was nearby, how she would speak to him and possibly reveal herself, her true nature. On the day of the meeting, I prepared carefully. I put on a wig that turned me into someone completely different, a more mature and confident version of myself, and added sunglasses to hide even the slightest hint of my presence. I paid close attention to my appearance, trying to look like someone else entirely. When I arrived at the cafe, I sat at a corner table, from where I had a good view of what was happening. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I tried to calm down, inhaling air filled with coffee and fresh pastries. But no matter what I did, the upcoming confrontation with my mother, her possible performance, all of it made me feel a sense of danger, as if I were facing some test I couldn't pass. Mark arrived first. He looked the same as always, calm and composed, almost unshakable. He sat at the table by the window, just as we had agreed, and waited. I watched him as he carefully adjusted his jacket and looked around. He was so balanced that, for a moment, I felt his calmness pass to me. A few minutes later, my mom walked into the cafe. I noticed her right away. She entered with the same look I had seen so many times before, confident, slightly arrogant, as if the world owed her something. She looked around, and I froze, feeling her gaze sweep across the room until it landed on Mark. I couldn't help but notice her confident smile, as if this meeting were something completely ordinary, pleasant, even though I knew that her true motives were hidden behind this facade. Mom approached the table with graceful fluidity, her steps confident, as if she knew exactly where she was going. "Mark, it's so nice to see you," she said in a warm, almost friendly tone that was completely at odds with how she behaved with me at home. She sat down across from him, smoothing the folds of her dress, and I noticed how her face softened, how she held in her inner tension. She was in her element, and it became clear to me that this was a performance for her. "Thank you for meeting, Helen," Mark replied, his voice calm, but I noticed a slight tension in his tone, as though he already sensed that something was off. He was ready for the conversation, but the conversation hadn't yet begun. Mom lowered her voice, and I could barely hear her next words, but I caught a barely perceptible hint of craftiness in her tone when she started talking about the proposal. It was strange, her manner of speaking had become much more closed off, as though she was on the verge of something important, not wanting me to overhear. "I think this is for the best," she said, and I felt the tension in the air grow, as though each word she uttered was part of a carefully orchestrated plan. What was she hiding? And what exactly did she mean by "for the best"? This was a puzzle I had to solve in order to understand how to move forward, how to break free from her web. Hiding behind my wig and sunglasses, I watched every gesture, every word, every glance. Now I knew that this conversation would be a turning point. Lily's smile grew wider when she noticed how the atmosphere around her was changing. It was the moment when she still didn't quite understand what was going on, but her innocent expression added a touch of absurdity to the whole situation. The mirror reflecting the scene showed my mother's self-satisfied expression. Rick, sitting next to her, looked utterly stunned, as if he couldn't believe his ears. His fork hung motionless in the air, and he looked at her with anxiety. "What are you talking about, Helen?" he asked, his voice trembling with disbelief. He didn't get a chance to continue before Mom began to explain something that was supposed to calm him down, but her words sounded empty and unconvincing. Mark, sitting across from me, caught my gaze. His slight wink was our signal. We began to act. I could wait no longer. I couldn't let this conversation pass unnoticed. I felt the tension building, and my heart started to race. This was the moment I had feared for so long, but at the same time, it felt necessary. I pulled my phone out of my bag, and without giving myself a chance to hesitate, I pressed the play button. The room fell silent, almost magically, as my mom's voice, coming from the phone, filled the space. I could see the looks of surprise and confusion crossing the faces of those present. The slight tension turned into complete silence. I never wanted Emily, her father left, and she just reminds me of all the bad times. Lily is my real daughter, the one who truly matters to me, my mom said, and these words hit like a blow, like thunder on a clear day. With each word, the recording became heavier. My body tensed with shock, but I remained calm. I watched her reaction. My mom, hearing her own words, turned pale, her eyes widening in shock. She clearly hadn't expected that her secret conversations would ever become public. Rick turned to her, bewildered, his face reflecting his utter inability to comprehend what was happening. "What is this, Emily?" Rick stumbled over his words, his voice full of pain. He tried to find words that could explain everything, but there were none. No excuses. I looked directly into my mother's eyes, not looking away, like I never had before. "Is this what you say to Mark?" I asked, trying to put into my voice all the words I had been too afraid to say before. "Is this really you, Mom?" My heart was pounding in my chest, but I stood my ground, not diverting my gaze. I couldn't allow myself to back down. I had stayed silent for too long. I had hidden my pain for too long. And now, when the moment had come, when the truth was finally out, I had to be strong. Mom tried to justify herself, but her words got caught in her throat. I saw her preparing to say something, but each word seemed to be laced with fear. She couldn't understand how I had found out. Her reaction was exactly what I had expected: desperation, anger, confusion. She tried to maintain control, but everything was already lost. Rick, still struggling with the shock, looked at her with condemnation, and then at me. He clearly didn't know what to do, didn't know how to process everything he had heard. I hadn't expected him to understand me immediately. In fact, I had long stopped expecting anything from people. I had lived with the knowledge that my mom didn't love me, that to her, I was nothing more than a reminder of the past. "Is this really how you think of me?" I asked, trying not to let the tears fall. The words carried all the pain that had built up over the years, but I didn't want my weakness to be visible. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of feeling that she had won again. I was ready to look her in the eyes, ready to see her reaction, even if it was bitter. Mom was silent. Her lips trembled, and her face was expressionless, as though she couldn't find a single justification for her words. With each passing second, her silence grew more oppressive, and I realized that there was no turning back. Everything that had been said was now spoken aloud,